love Celtic stories so much, and this is a story that comes from Scotland. It is a story that begins on Islay, one of the islands of Scotland. There was once a smith, and he worked every day in his smithy. He had a young son, a lad of about 12 years old. The boy's mother had died years before, and so it was just the two of them, but happy they were. And then one day, after breakfast, the smith invited his son to come with him to the smithy. He'd been doing that ever since he was a small boy, watching his father work and helping wherever he could. But this day, the boy said, no, he didn't want to come. He wasn't feeling well. Well, that was unusual. But the father said, well, then rest today, and I'm sure you will be feeling much better by the time I come back tonight. And so the smith went on and did his work, but when he came back that night, the lad seemed no better. He was lying in his bed, and he'd been there all day. When he summoned him to supper, the boy just gave a groan and turned his face to the wall and continued to sleep. And after that, everything was different. The lad had always been lively and active and gregarious, but now he was wan and listless and weary. He slept most of the day. And the father did invite him to eat. Well, the boy ate with quite an appetite, but the food didn't seem to do him much good because he got thinner and thinner and paler until finally the father began to fear for his son's life. One day, the father was at the smithy when one of his friends came in, and he said, how is everything going? Oh, you don't look so well. You look like a man facing death itself. What's wrong? He said, well, if I am facing death, it will not be my own, but that of my son. And he went on to tell about the change in his son and how worried he was. And the friend said, well, I can tell you that the lad at your home is not your son. Not my son, he said. Well, then who would it be? A changeling. The Fae have taken your son and have replaced him with one of their own. Oh, said the smith. Are you sure? Well, quite sure. Well, how can I be sure? He said. And so the friend gave him some instructions. He said, tonight, when you go home, take a dozen eggs, crack them, fill the eggshells with water, and arrange them in front of the fireplace. Why? Said the smith. Well, yes, your son will ask about that, won't he? And you will say, oh, I'm just waiting for the water to boil. But that's ridiculous, said the smith. Indeed it is. And the lad will say that. And then you must take peats and pile them on the fire so the fire is very hot. And when the lad asks why you need such a hot fire, then grab him and make as though you're going to throw him into the fire. I could never do that, said the smith. Well, do not worry. If the lad is indeed your son, he will call out and he will resist. But if he is one of the Fae, he will disappear up the chimney. Well, now he was assured that no one would be harmed. And so the smith agreed to do as the friend had suggested. He went home. The lad was in bed, but he seemed to be awake. The smith took a dozen eggs, cracked them, filled all the eggshells with water, and then very carefully laid them out in a semicircle in front of the fire. The lad said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm just waiting for the water to boil. But that's ridiculous, said the lad. The smith said nothing, but piled some peats onto the fire and stirred it to make it nice and hot. And why do you need such a hot fire, said the lad. And the smith went to grab him, and the lad disappeared up the chimney. And so now the smith knew that in fact it was a changeling. It was not his son. The changeling was gone, but where was his son? Well, he went back to ask his friend if he had any advice, and the friend told him what to do. He said, go to the nearby hill, a fairy hill, and stamp your foot 3 times, and go armed with a dirk and an iron bar and a rooster. Keep the rooster inside your jacket. And so the smith did just that. He went over to the hill, he stomped his foot 3 times, and a crack opened up in the hill. He could see some light coming out of the crack. And then he took his dirk and placed it in the threshold to ensure that he would be able to leave when he wanted to. And he entered the fairy hill. Well, he saw his son surrounded by the Fae folk, and he called out to him. When the Fae realized that he was there, a great commotion went up. They said, "What are you doing here? Go away, leave us, you do not belong here." "I have come for my son," said the smith, "and I will not leave until I have him." "That you will not get," they said. And they began to call out to him and order him to leave. And with all of the hullabaloo, well, that woke the rooster that had been tucked inside the smith's jacket. And the rooster began to flap and say cock-a-doodle-doo, and feathers began flying everywhere. And with all of the hullabaloo, well, the Fae folk were agitated, to say the very least. They ordered them out of the fairy hill. In fact, they grabbed them and threw them out. They had been safe inside the hill because, of course, the smith had an iron bar, and as you probably know, iron is a proof against fairies. Now they were thrown out of the fairy hill, and when the Fae saw the dirk in the threshold, they yanked it out and tossed it after them. And so now the smith went home with a lad who was his son. And things were not better immediately. He took the boy with him to the smithy every day. The boy, instead of participating or even talking, just sat there and watched. But one day the smith he was to make a fine sword, a very expensive piece. He'd been commissioned by a local prince, and he was working away at forging the sword when suddenly the lad spoke up, and the lad said, "That's not how you make a sword. Let me show you how you make a sword." And he leapt up and came over to the forge and grabbed the tools and began to fashion the sword. And the method that he used was something that was completely unfamiliar to the smith. The resulting sword, the finest sword that anyone had ever seen. The prince was very pleased and showed it to all of the people that he knew. And they all wanted swords like that too. And so they went to the smithy and ordered swords, and the son taught his father the methods that he'd learned. Now, was it just that his son was intelligent? Or was it his intuition? Or had he learned some special methods from the Fae? Who knows? But everyone acknowledged that all of the swords that came from that smithy were the finest swords that anyone had ever seen. And so they paid handsomely for them. And the smith and his son, they became famous in that town, and on that island, and all around Scotland. And the more people who ordered swords, the more money they made. And so they became not only famous, but rather rich. And they lived out their lives in contentment and peace. Now, tragically, the method seems to have been lost in the intervening centuries. But you may be able to see such a sword if you go to a museum in Scotland. You can ask about that. What is certain is that if you go to Islay today, you can see the ruins of the smithy. So this was hundreds of years ago. And if you walk just a bit north, you can see the fairy hill. And that is the story of the smith and his son. And a good lesson. Don't mess with those fairy folks, right?